So as we record this, 2 days away from Thomas Frank's first game in charge against PSG in the UEFA Super Cup, along with some potentially big transfer news for Tottenham Hotspur. So much has been said about Tottenham Hotspur's window so far, and more of what they've not done than what they have done has been highlighted. Again, it feels a bit like Spurs are going into a season undercooked, like they have done for so many years. It feels a bit like Groundhog Day. We've seen it under Mauricio Pochettino, Jose Mourinho, Antonio Conte, Nuno, Ange Postecoglou, and now Thomas Frank is the latest manager to be added to that list in terms of managers that have gone into the season perhaps a bit undercooked. But this one, it looks like Spurs are, starting to act in the transfer market. By all accounts, £50 million may be enough to prize Savinho away from Manchester City after just one season. Savinho obviously started his career in Europe, really in France. I think is it Troyes or Tra? I think they're called. Um, Before moving on to Girona and then being bought last summer by Manchester City. Um, didn't Hasn't really worked out so far with Savinho at Manchester City, but I think there's definitely enough signs there that he really could become a top player. And I think the fact that Guardiola decided to sign him is an indicator of his potential. Obviously, we've seen. That's not to say that all of Pep Guardiola's signings at Man City have been a major success. We've seen the likes of Claudio Bravo, Calvin Phillips, Jack Grealish. But I think what is encouraging is the fact that Manchester City don't really get this wrong. Even the ones that they have sold relatively early, the likes of Ferran Torres, still a very good player. So for him to be identified by Manchester City and the City group and Guardiola, I think is really encouraging. Um, Rumours saying that about 50 million will get him out of Man City, and that he's quite keen on the move. So um, that's about as far as it's got so far. But if this is a deal that we pursue, I really could see it being a good one. It's a player he's mostly played on the right at Manchester City, but by all accounts, more predominantly a left-sided player that we've seen in France and during his time at Girona in Spain. Um, Obviously, the need for a 10 is still there. It really is. But at least with Savinho on the left, that's sort of your Son replacement accounted for in that sense. Whether or not he reaches the sort of goals and assists that Son did at Spurs remains to be seen. But of course, he's still a young player, still only 21. And I think back to the opening game of last season when it was Chelsea versus Manchester City at Stamford Bridge, and everyone was sort of watching it thinking, who is this guy? He taken number 26, and it really looked like they'd cloned Riyad Mahrez in that sense. Bit of a drop off later on in the season, but that was to be expected with Manchester City's form. And it seems weird that you'd say that Manchester City are in transition because of the endless supply, and obviously they've got the best manager in the world. But apart from that, yeah, really encouraging if we can get this done. And then I think if we can get this done and maybe a number 10, I think that's a good window for Spurs. Obviously, it's not quite done. If it's up to me, I know you obviously can't get it all done in one window, but I think if that was if that's how we conclude our business with maybe, I don't know, a Bilal El Khanous from Leicester to plug that gap behind the striker, at least in the absence of James Maddison and Dejan Kulusevski. I think you're starting to get towards a good window, and then maybe in January we can reassess for that left-sided centre back or that left back that Thomas Frank seems to want. But on a transfer front, yeah, encouraging if we can get this done. I'm a bit sceptical about us finalising deals, but maybe that's just a bit of post-traumatic stress from the Morgan Gibbs-White saga earlier in the summer. But moving on to Thomas Frank's first competitive game in charge, PSG, Champions League winners in the Super Cup. First time I think both teams have been in the Super Cup, so both teams will really be wanting to win it. I know it's a bit of a European Community Shield really, in that sense. I wouldn't say it's a major trophy, unless Tottenham win it, of course, then I'll be unbearable about that. Um, but some good news coming out of Spurs today is that Dominic Solanke and Destiny Udogie have travelled to be part of that squad. Udogie didn't go to Hong Kong, and I don't think Solanke. Well, I think Solanke might have, but I don't know if he played at all. I don't think he did. Don't quote me on that. But moving on to the opponents, PSG is a team that's dominated French football for the past decade, really, barring two or three seasons that they didn't win the league, if that. Um, but this PSG team just feels a bit different to the ones that have gone by in yesteryear. It seems to be a more collective unit rather than the individual quality that they've relied on in the past with likes of Kylian Mbappe, Neymar, Messi. Um, that front three is really interchangeable. Desiree Doué, um, who Tottenham did try and sign before he went to PSG. Ousmane Dembele, who seems to be having a fantastic season, really. I think he's going to be up there with shouts for the Ballon d'Or. Whether or not he wins it is a separate matter. And then, of course, you've got Kvicha Kvaratskhelia, who I suppose we're rumoured to be looking at before Brian Gill, but I think in hindsight, a lot of people have sort of, I wouldn't say embellished, but they've definitely sort of made out like it was a bit of a closer deal than it actually was. In terms of PSG, how they play, we've seen it in the Champions League. They really, really rely on that front three. They like to get the ball. They like to push teams back as as far back as they can. Really, we've seen that in the Club World Cup where they're almost kicking into touch straight from the kickoff just to assert their dominance and sort of push the other teams back. And it's a game that, if I'm honest, I'm a lot more confident. Not to say that I am confident in general, really, about this, but I feel more comfortable is probably the way I'd put it with Thomas Frank in charge of this rather than Ange Postecoglou. And that's not as slight on Ange. I think it's just tactically. Um, I think PSG are sort of playing in the image that Ange Postecoglou wanted Tottenham to play in, playing high up the pitch, high line, really relying on individual brilliance from wide players. Whether or not he got that at Tottenham is another thing. And then the midfield three congesting in sort of towards the edge of our box just to really, really apply pressure. And if I'm honest, last season Ange Postecoglou, a lot of the failings we've seen tactically were deep balls to the back post for wide forwards to get onto. That really wasn't something that we addressed. In terms of other factors, we said about how PSG like to really get that midfield pushing high up the pitch and putting the opposition on the back foot. And the amount of space that we left in the midfield last year, I think really, really was a problem. And I think that would have been brutal if PSG were playing against Postecoglou in the setup that he had last season. Thomas Frank, a bit more conservative. I think the focus really on Spurs and the sort of yardstick that you'd measure Tottenham and Thomas Frank on this year is their defence, because personnel-wise, a back four, Porro, Romero, Van de Ven, Udogie, can even throw Spencer on either side. It's a solid core, but I think tactically, we probably didn't see the best of that last season. Obviously, since I last uploaded a video, Tottenham have made another signing in João Paulinho, and I think he's going to be really, really key in this. PSG's João Neves is going to be missing this game, so the midfield battle really, really is going to be important. And I think that's where the game's going to be won and lost, if I'm honest. I fully expect us to sit back and try and hit PSG on the counter attack. I think we've seen some goals like that in pre-season, particularly Pap Sarr has played a big role in winning the ball back high up the pitch. And yeah, I think it's going to be a real battle. But I think it's a good way for Thomas Frank to stamp his authority on this Tottenham side. So if you look at the goalkeeper, Antonin Kinski's played marginally more minutes than Guillermo Vicario this pre-season. I don't think he'll get the nod here. I think Vicario is still firmly number one, but I fully expect Kinski to push him a little bit more this year. So in goal, I've gone for Vicario, and then I think we'll line up with a back four of Porro, Romero, Van der Ven, and Spence. Jed Spence, I'd expect him to start over Ben Davies and over Destiny Udogie. Stylistically over Davies, and then just in terms of sharpness ahead of Udogie. Spence is a player which, by all accounts, seemed to recommend Desiree Doué to Spurs. If you're to believe that, of course, played with Doué at Rennes, so he's a player I know well. So it'd be interesting to see how he copes against Desiree Doué. And then in terms of a midfield three, it's really going to have to be dogged in there. It's really going to have a lot of runners working tirelessly off the ball. And I think the midfield three is going to go for is João Paulinho, maybe sitting at the base of that three, and then Papsar and Lucas Bergvall just ahead of him. It could be argued whether Bentancur will be in there for Bergvall if there's a bit more of a defensive approach like we've seen in the Europa League final. So that's going to be an interesting one. Bergvall's not really looked too sharp this pre-season, but obviously he's coming back from an injury. He's still only 18 or 19, so that's not me writing off Bergvall by any chance. I think he's a great player. And then moving into the front three, Kudus is definitely going to start. I feel like he's been our star of pre-season. You can really, really see the quality that he's added to this Spurs team. Which, if I'm honest, whenever I watch Spurs and we've got a clear upgrade on a position like Kudus is on that right-hand side, I really don't see how the Spurs hierarchy don't see how much of a difference that makes and thinks, yeah, we could do with one or two more in that starting 11, or maybe another squad player that can really challenge them and reach those levels. But that's a conversation for another time. I expect Kudus to start on the right. On the left, it could be either of Tell or Audebert. I've not watched all of pre-season because obviously a lot of things like working and not sort of aligning with that sort of timing. So I think Audebert, especially for a team which is going to want to get up the pitch and maybe carry the ball 20 yards to relieve some pressure, I think he's probably a little bit better at doing that than Matthias Tell. So I think he'll probably start on the left, and then through the middle, I think it's going to be a game for Richarlison. Dominic Solanke is travelling with the team, but again, he's like Udogie. He's not played a load of pre-season, so I fully expect Richarlison to start there. And yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting. Whether or not the team that plays on Wednesday is going to be the team that faces Burnley on the weekend remains to be seen. But it just feels like this is a good opportunity for Frank because it can go one of two ways. I feel like if we were to lose this game even valiantly, it's going to be, oh, well, Tottenham finally had a manager who'd won something and they sacked him for this. Thomas Frank has never won anything, which is just regressive, and it's just such a basic argument because it doesn't take into account the job that he's done at Brentford or the sort of nuances that come along with our Europa League win and that sort of thing. But if he can pull it off and he can get a trophy underneath his belt first game, there's not much of a better start than that. And then, I feel like then the sort of outside noises about Thomas Frank and the sort of narrative around replacing Ange Postecoglou, that would dim it down a little bit. It would give him a bit more breathing room before the Sharks start circling. The Sharks being within the Tottenham fan base, but yeah, I'd love to say I think we're going to win it. I could see us nicking a 1-0. That's what my head says. That's what my heart says. Sorry, but my head, I could probably see us taking the lead quite early and then them just having too much for us. So I'm going to go for PSG 3, Tottenham 1. But again, love to be wrong. I'd love to see Romero lifting that trophy. I'd love to see him lifting that trophy come Wednesday evening. Again, it's going to be a bit of an interesting one. This is the first competitive game, and we've not really got an answer for who's going to be the new captain. I think it's a bit of a everyone knows it's going to be Romero. I think we're just waiting for that confirmation. And in terms of Romero, I think he's a player that I'm going to be watching closely this season because the thing that I find frustrating with Romero, the quality, you cannot doubt it at all. On his day, I was in the ground when we won the Europa League and I was just watching him towards that latter stages, watching how he commanded the team. And he's got all of the ingredients to be an absolute cult hero, but it feels like we've just not seen it enough at Spurs this year. A lot of people, well, not even this year, but this year would be unfair, but I mean generally in his Spurs career. And also, I feel like a lot of people were saying about how Argentina's sort of been the priority over Tottenham for Romero, and obviously South Americans are obviously very passionate about international football, probably more so than we are in this country. But yeah, I feel like if Frank is to give him that captain's armband, that's sort of a line in the sand to say you can't you can't prioritise Argentina over Tottenham. You know, you're a captain, so you need to lead by example. So if he's to get the armband, I think that's a good piece of man management, and hey, might even help secure his future at Tottenham. I know there's been a lot of links to Atletico Madrid, but if he can stick around for a few years, he's got all of the ingredients to become an absolute icon at this club. Um, but yeah, I think that's where we'll end it. So looking ahead to tomorrow, my fingers will be crossed that Thomas Frank starts his Tottenham career with a trophy, a European trophy, much like his predecessor Ange Postecoglou, but perhaps on a bit of a lower scale. So all that's left to do now is to wait until Wednesday evening and see if it will be Luis Enrique or Thomas Frank with a winner's medal round their neck. And until then, up the Spurs.